Good evening, everybody.
How are you?
Oh, Hashem, thank you.
Oh, Hashem.
Yeah, so we're doing design, it seems. So it says here the Bet Yosef, אסור להטביל כלי חדש, או להטבילו מטומאתו, ונתפאר בסימן שכ"ג, ויתברר עוד בסימן תקי"א. So he says, right, that there's a prohibition to immerse a new utensil, or to immerse it because of the impurity. So he says this was already covered in a different place in the Shulchan Aruch, in the Tur. במה מותר לשפשף את הכלים ובמה אסור נתבהר בסימן שכ"ג. Also it says there are rules about how to wash and rinse utensils, to clean them, cleansing. לעניין Shabbat, regarding Shabbat, it says ונראה דהו הדין לעניין יום טוב. So he says the same thing applies to Yom Tov as well, right? Whatever we learned over there, you apply over here. That's what he says. Okay. So it seems like there's something else here. Yeah, another one here. So it says, Katwot Tosot. It says Tosot, the Perek Kama de Betza. The first Perek of Betza. Chet Amud Aleph. Hadi Amar Rav Yehuda lo shanu ela sheusak me'erev Yom Tov. So, right, regarding what Rav Yehuda said there, ואם תאמר ואנו איך אנו מסלקין אפר קירה ביום טוב להפות הפשטידה אף על פי שאין ראוי לצלות בו ביצה. So he says, right, if you're going to ask me, right, about this, what does that mean? How do we remove the ashes from the stove? In those days, they used to use wood, right, in the stove, but today we use gas and electric, right? But in those days, it was wood. So the question is, right, how do you remove the ashes? How do we do that on Yom Tov? It says the mukse eno asur letaltel b'Yom Tov b'shul ochel nefesh. Oh, so look what it says, right? That muksa is not prohibited to carry on Yom Tov because of consumption, right? Just like we permit laborers because of consumption, all the more so we're going to permit, right, muksa, which is the rabbinical. That's what he's saying. Simchat Yom Tov, and he says also there's another reason why we're going to allow it, because of Simchat Yom Tov, enjoying the Yom Tov. V'raya milakaman. So we learn this from something which comes later on, Perek and Sadin, right over there in Kaf Chet Amud Bet. Atkan v'kach hatav Mordechai. That's what it says in Mordechai also. Perek Bechol hame'arbin. Okay, so that's what we have here. Let's see Shulchan Aruch. Okay, so this one we didn't do Vav. We're gonna do this after. So first we'll go to Zion, and we'll come back to that. So it says here like this: להטביל כלי חדש ביום טוב דינו כמו בשבת. כדאית בסימן שכ"ג סעיף ז'. Right. So he says regarding immersing, right, a new utensil, it's like Shabbat. He says same thing. So same rule you have on Shabbat is the same rule you have here. Kedita is like we have there in chapter 323. So the truth is, I must tell you that the Sfardim are lenient about this. So what does that mean? That they do immerse new utensils in the mikveh on Shabbat and Yom Tov. Right? The Ashkenazim are stringent, if I remember correctly, like the Tur said, So when it comes to immersing a utensil to cleanse it from impurity, today we don't do that, right? Because we're not particular about impurity, so therefore we're all impure as it is anyway. So, right, we don't care really about that. So it says the Rama here, "V'din hadacha v'shifshuv kelim b'yom tov, kemo b'Shabbat." So he says regarding rinsing, and as we said, right, cleansing utensils, same thing as Shabbat. Whatever you can do on Shabbat, you can do in Yom Tov. Like it says over there, in that chapter 323, right? So he brings what the Beit Yosef just said, that you're allowed to carry muktzah for the sake of consumption, as we said, because consumption is something which is allowed on Yom Tov to work for, to do labors for. So all the more so, right, when it comes to muktzah, which is derabanan, it's only rabbinical. So all the more so we're going to allow it for that purpose as well. So yeah, regarding, right, what he's talking here about washing utensils. So what is the halakha, by the way? Are you allowed to wash dishes on Shabbat, Yom Tov? So the truth is, the rule is like this, if you well know, that if a person is eating more meals on Shabbat, right? So let's say he had the night meal, then he's going to have the day meal, right? And also, in the daytime, he's going to have Seudah Shlishit, the third meal. So if there's more meals left, so then the rule is you're allowed to wash dishes, because you have more meals coming up. So you can use those dishes, for the next meal. So there's no prohibition, right? But once, you finished all your meals on Shabbat, so then, you really shouldn't wash dishes on Shabbat. And the reason is because exertion, for no purpose, whatever, right? This is the reason why they forbade that. So it depends, right? As we said, on your timing, whatever, right? If you have any more meals left on Shabbat or Yom Tov, same thing. But when it comes to drinking vessels, right, the cups and the glasses and things like this, right, the rabbis say you can do that all day, wash them. Why is that? Because you're always going to drink another cup of water, or have another coffee, you know what I mean? So it doesn't really matter if you have any meals left or not. You can always have a drink, any time of the day. So therefore, when it comes to drinking your vessels, you're allowed to wash them all day. There's really no problem with that. So there's another thing, which comes up in halakha, which is, sometimes a person, just is disgusted, by having so many dishes in the sink, even though he has no more meals left. But it just doesn't look nice for him. Some people don't like to have dirty dishes in the sink. So if you're one of those types, right? So if you're one of those types, what choice do you have, right? Basically. So as we said, right, if you have another meal coming up, no problem. You can wash everything. But if you don't, right, there's a couple of tricks you can do. One
Hide them
thing
in the
is,
dishwasher.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Hide them in the dishwasher.
Yeah, the truth is, I'm laughing, but you're right. That's a very good thing to do. Why not? Put them in the dishwasher. And you got no problem there. So it's out of sight, right? Out of sight, out of mind, as they say, right? And even if you don't have a dishwasher, right, what you can do is just cover them, if you want, in the sink, whatever, cover the sink. I don't know, God knows, right? You can do one of those things. Yeah, so it depends on the situation, right? There's a solution for everything. Another trick you can do is, like when you wash your hands, in the sink, you can like also rinse the dishes, like when you wash your hands. You know what I mean? Like the rinsing from the water from the washing of the hands will also, rinse the dishes somewhat, not totally, but right, somewhat it'll rinse it, whatever. There's all kinds of tricks like that people do. So just like opening the tap, and like pouring some water over it, there's really no prohibition, when it comes to that. Uh, just that's okay, no matter what. So, you do have solutions, as we said, right? It's not really a big problem. There's also another question which comes up, regarding, are you allowed to use a dishwasher, right, for Shabbat and Yom Tov, So the truth is that most rabbis are stringent about this, They don't want you using a dishwasher. Even if you're using it with a timer. Uh, you know, so the reason why they're a little bit scared of this is because they say, that let's say your timer, is like on, and then if you close the door of the dishwasher, it'll start, and you won't, so like by closing the door, you're starting it sometimes. And it's like already on, so all you got to do is close the door. So, since people can make mistakes like that, that's why the rabbis try to discourage that. But the truth is, that according to halakha, really, there's no prohibition if you're using a timer. Bare bones halakha, there's no prohibition. I mean, see, the problem is like this. When it comes to dishwashers, it's not only the fact that you're doing exertion. There's no exertion, right? Just pressing a button, right? What kind of exertion is that? It's nothing. But here's the thing, that the problem is that you're cooking the water. When you close the door of the dishwasher and it starts to work, it cooks the water. So it's like cooking there going on. This is the problem. And that's why some rabbis, are very cautious about that. They don't tell people that it's allowed to do that. Like, but the truth is, that there's no prohibition, technically speaking, to use a timer because it's grama, indirect causation, right? So grama on Shabbat is okay, it's not really a problem. As long as you said, right, as long as you're careful that your timer is not on. Sometimes people are not careful about that. They're not mindful about these things, So this is the problem. Yeah, that's the story. There's another issue, by the way, which comes up, which is, when you put the dishes in the dishwasher, so some rabbis will tell you, don't do that because you're doing sorting, right? In other words, you're aligning, you're putting the dishes, everything in its particular place in the dishwasher, right? So you're like sorting the dishes, But the truth is, some rabbis are not really particular about that. My rabbi, Maran Shalom, he wasn't really particular about this. He said that there's no prohibition there. So there is what to rely on, if you want to do it. And also, if you want to really be stringent, what you do is, like don't sort them, in the dishwasher. Just put them, like randomly, like haphazard. Just put them in. And then you can sort them afterwards, right? After Shabbat goes out or Yom Tov, you can sort them then, right? If you want to, sort them, whatever, right? But the truth is, there's no prohibition when it comes to that. Some rabbis are a little bit stringent about that, but technically speaking, not really a problem. Okay, so that's the story there. So we'll go to Chet, if there is Chet. Looks like not. Okay, well, looks like we're done. So let me just make sure we finished everything in the Bet Yosef, and we'll go to the next chapter. Okay. Okay. So we're going to Tough Kufyud, right? Which is 510. So yeah, so it says it through like this. מוללין מלילות ומפרחין קטניות ביום טוב ומנפה מעט מעט ואוכל אפילו לקנון ותמחוי אבל לא בנפה וכברה, right? So it's talking here about the prohibition of like removing the husk from certain foods. So the question is, are you allowed to do that, you know? Or is there a prohibition of like separating, you know, or right, or winnowing, right? Whatever that's called. So it seems like he's telling you that you can do it, but right, he says do it little by little, you know. So meaning what he wants you to do it like a shinui, you know, a little bit of differentiation. Don't do it the normal way. Doing like a big amount, large quantities. But he says don't use right to remove the husk. Don't use like sifters, you know, because that's a normal way. To remove the bran, to whatever, to remove the, you know, right, the chaff, whatever it is, right? That's the normal way. So don't do like that, he says. Okay, so right, it's not really so clear cut. We'll see in Bet Yosef, right? More details about what this means practically, right? Okay. So says Bet Yosef, he brings a Gemara, right? He talks about this. Memra de Rava beperek kama de Betzah. It's in the first parak of Betzah, Yud Bet Amud Aleph, Amud Bet. V'ha de Tanya hamolel melilot merev yom tov למחר מנפח על יד ואוכל ואפילו בקנון ואפילו אפילו בתמחוי אבל לא בטבלה ולא בנפה ולא בכברה מסיק בגמרא דהוא הדין ביום טוב שרי למלול אלא איידי דתנא רשע דברייתא מערב שבת תנא נמי ספר מערב יום טוב. פירש רש"י מפרחין היינו שמפרח השרביטין ומוציא הזרע. Right, so Rashi explains, right, what are we talking about here? That you're removing the husk, right, whatever, the outer, you know, shell, and removing, right, and eating, you know, the inside, right, using the inside, which is like a seed, whatever, right? So things like this, right? So it's telling you that do it like, you know, a little bit of an abnormal way. Little by little, you know, not big amounts. So he says, right, that Rashi continues, Molin melilot dash kilach hayadu, right? So it's like you're threshing in an abnormal way, right? Again, to remove the husks, right? To remove the chaff. Melilot, right? What's melilot? Shel chitin shemolin be'adav. So he says, what we do is we take the wheat, right, and we remove the chaff, you know, with like, you know, with our hands. So not in the normal manner. Kishehem rakim, right? When they're soft, he says. Al yad, right? So what does that mean? Me'at me'at, right? You do it like little by little, as we said. Aval lo betavla, right? But don't do it in a, right, with a board, you know, which is like, you know, larger quantities. So why is that? Because it looks like you're doing it for tomorrow, right? In other words, why do you need so much, you know, to do such a large quantity? So it looks like you're doing it for tomorrow. Says why? Because if you're using these utensils already, you know, so then you're already doing large amounts, you know. So that's the thing, right? Do it, but you know, don't do it in the normal way, because you know, in the normal way, you're talking about big amounts. You know, it looks like you're doing a large amount. Looks like you're doing it for tomorrow. So therefore, the rabbi said, don't do that. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's not really something that we, do often nowadays, these kinds of things. But in their times, it was more common. Today, everything you go to the store, you buy everything ready-made, so you're not really removing the husk or whatever, things like this, right? Not really so common today. You're buying ready-made flour, ready-made this, ready-made that, right? Everything's ready-made. So, okay, whatever. Anyway, right? So then he goes on, כתב הר"ן, says הר"ן, מוללין מלילות דש כלאחר יד הוא, ואפילו בשבת לאו איסור מדאורייתא הוא, אלא מדרבנן וביום טוב לא גזור. Right, so he says, right, that the Ran, that doing it with a shinui, right, like this, like we said, this kind of thing. So meaning what, you're moving the chaff from the wheat, right, the bran, whatever it is, right? So he says, right, that this is like the abnormal way, doing it little by little, with your hands. So he says, right, that therefore on Yom Tov it's allowed, but it says on Shabbat, not even this is not allowed. So the rabbis decreed on Shabbat not to do it even the abnormal way, but when it comes to Yom Tov, they didn't decree that. Why? Because you, as we said, right, it's consumption, So the rabbis were more lenient with that. Okay, but as we said, as long as you don't do it for tomorrow, right? You're doing a lot of big quantity, no good. Okay, so the Katav Harav Magid, Peg Gimel, says Rav Magid Sover, right? So it says Rabbeinu holds should be Yom Tov Molel Kedarko, right? And Yom Tov you can do it the normal way. Oh, look at that, right? So he says, right, the Rambam holds you can do it the normal way, below shino, without any differentiation. The Chen Dat Halachot, also the Halachot, the Rif, right? Uma Shamru Ketzat Molel Veitzrichu Shinui. So it says that which they said in the Talmud, you got to do Shinui with this. Hu b'Shabbat dafka. He says that's only in Shabbat. On Shabbat you need a Shinui, but on Yom Tov you can do it the regular way. That's what the Rambam holds, according to this opinion, right? Okay, interesting. So he says, even though there are others who differ with this, but that's halakha, he says, right? That we're lenient about that. Ran also says, שלדעת קצת כי אמרינן מוללין ביום טוב דווקא על ידי שינוי, אבל בשבת אסור אפילו על ידי שינוי, והוכיח שאין כן דעת הריף. So he says, right, that as we said, we have two opinions over here. We have the first opinion, which we saw in the tour, right, which was that on Yom Tov you could do with a shinui, but on Shabbat you can't even do with a shinui, right? But he says the Rif doesn't hold like that, as we just said, right? The Rambam doesn't hold like that. The Rif also. So what does he hold? He holds like the Rambam, which is that on Yom Tov it's allowed to do even the normal way. Even without shinui. So says Bet Yosef that the Ran seems to agree with this, right? With the Rif and the Rambam. Also the Rosh, right? So so that's how we paskin, he says. So therefore the rule is, right, that we're lenient about this. Says the Bet Yosef. Makes sense? Okay, so let's see Shulchan Aruch here. Interesting. We got to bring it up. Okay. Tough Kuf Yud. Tough Kuf Yud. Okay, so says Shulchan Aruch, Molelin melilot umfarchin kitniot kedarkan, right? So he says, so he paskins like the Rambam, right? As we saw, that you're allowed to, remove the husks, right, from these things, as we said, right, wheat and things like this, in the normal way on Yom Tov, B'Yom Tov. מנפח מעט מעט ואוכל, right? So when it comes to, he says, like, doing it with the, winnowing, like, blowing on it, right? Whatever. So he says you can do little by little, ואוכל and eat. אפילו בקנון ותמחוי. You could even use, right, these types of utensils, which are, sort of the normal way. אבל לא בטבלה ולא בנפה ולא בכברה. But he says don't use these things, right, which are the board and the sifter, right, the sifters. So those are like totally, totally like weekday kind of things, right? You're doing large quantities when you do like that. So therefore, he says don't use that, right? For the sake of sifting out, right? Sifting things. It's like we call that like threshing, whatever. Okay, so that's the story there. As we said, right? We don't really do this very much, on nowadays, these kinds of things. But I guess the closest thing we have to this, is that we eat like, things which have shells, right? Like nuts, and seeds. So that you're allowed to do because you're eating, even on Shabbat, right? You open it up and you eat it, right? There's no problem with that, Nobody argues about that. Okay, very good. So let's go on to Bet. Right, so it says the tour like this. הבורר קטניות או שאר דבר, אם יש טורח לברירת האוכל. So it says, what about, right, you're selecting, when it comes to kidneyot, legumes, or some other things. אם יש טורח לברירת האוכל, so it's as if it's like an exertion to do this. יותר מפסולת, if it's more an exertion to remove the food, the food, than to remove the chaff, right, the refuse. כגון שהאוכל מרובה. Why? Because the food is greater, right, in terms of quantity than the refuse. So borek kedarko, you do it the normal way. Lizrok הפסולת. So what does that mean? That you're going to throw away the chaff, right, the refuse. ואם טורח הוא יותר בבריאת הפסולת, but it says if it's more exertion to sift out, right, to select out the chaff. כגון שהוא דק, for instance, he says, let's say it's very, it's very, right, how do you say this? Very fine, right? Fine stuff, right? Not very large. נוטל האוכל ומניח בסלו. So then he says what you do is you take the food and leave the, right, the chaff, the waste product. So what is he telling you here, right? The tour. It's always better to do the way which gives you less exertion, So depending on, the situation, whatever is less painstaking, right? Whatever is less work, so you do it that way. ודווקא כשאוכל מרובה על הפסולת. That's only if the food is more than the waste, right? מכמותו, right? The quantity. ומשכחת לה באוכל מרובה. ואפילו הכי, so it says, let's say you have a lot of food there. אפילו הכי יש טורח יותר בברירת הפסולת. But it says, nevertheless, it's still more cumbersome to remove the chaff. כגון שהוא דק, like as we said, right? It's very fine. The pre-sheet, like we explained. אבל אם כמות הפסולת מרובה אסור. But it says, but if the amount of chaff, waste product, is more than the food, then it says it's forbidden. אפילו לטלטלו, even to carry that stuff, he says. שהאוכל בטל ברוב. Why is that? No, look what he says. Wow. So he says here the food is nullified in a majority. Because the majority over here is waste product. Wow. מכל מקום, לוזים ובוטנים שנשתברו ועדיין מעורין בקליפה, ואף על פי שהפסולת מרובה על האוכל, המותרים, דלא מקרה פסולת מרובה, כיוון חי ובהכי. So he says, as I just mentioned, right, he mentions this over here, that, if we're talking about eating, nuts, right, with a shell, or seeds, so there he says, even though the waste product is more than the food, it's okay, because that's the regular way of eating, that's how you eat, how else are you going to eat, right? So therefore you're allowed to, right, remove the husk, remove the shell, the chaff, right, and eat it, that's the way we do it. So this is considered like you're right guarding the fruit. So it doesn't resemble, it says, the case of like when it comes to bones and shells, because those are already like totally separated from the food, they're like by themselves. So that's muksa, mina ochel. So therefore, right, we're more stringent about that. But when it's still mixed up with the food together, so there, it's the way to eat it like that. So what are you gonna do, right? Let's say, for instance, you're eating, walnuts, right? So walnuts, they have a shell. And today, we go to the store, we buy walnuts without a shell. But in the old days, you have to open up the shell. That's the way it was, right? So, but you're allowed to do that, to crack the shell and open it, because how can you eat otherwise? Right? That's the way to eat it. Even though the waste product could be larger than the food itself. That's what he's saying. Okay, good. So let's see the Beit Yosef on this one. So says Beit Yosef, he brings a source for this, right? Hakol nitbaer b'siman shin yud tet, right? It's explained over there. Chapter 319, right? Which is the laws of Shabbat, right? So you gotta. So he says, but he says, if you're using, right, like sifters, and these kinds of things, you're not allowed to do it on Yom Tov for this purpose, right? For separating the chaff. This is what it says in the Gemara there. First parak of Betzah, Yudal Amud Bet. So he says, the Rabbeinu, the two here, didn't bother to write this over here, this halacha. Why is that? Because he already, he relied on what he wrote regarding the issue of separating the chaff from the wheat, right? So the same idea. Okay, good. So then he goes on. Katav Ramagid, says Ramagid, Pek Gimel Katav Rashba. He brings the Rashba. Shema Amru Aval Lo Benafa. That which they said, right? That you can't use a sifter, as we said, right? Or one of those utensils like that. So it says, if you would do that on Shabbat, right, to use a sifter, you'd be liable to, right, for transgressing, for desecrating Shabbat on that. So that's very, that's pretty severe on Shabbat, right? Therefore, he says they didn't want to allow this on Yom Tov, to do this, to use a sifter, because you may come to do it on Shabbat. Interesting. Okay. מתוך הטעם הזה יצא לו שכל מה שיש בשבת חיוב חטאת, כגון בורר שלא לאכול לאלתר, אלא להניח לבוא ביום, אפילו ביום טוב אסור. So he says, therefore he brings a certain rule like this, which is that whatever on Shabbat, has prohibition, right, of desecrating Shabbat from the Torah. For instance, like as we said, right, sifting, things and, selecting things like this, which are really, on Shabbat, they're like very strictly forbidden. So he says, therefore, they don't allow them on Yom Tov either. The rabbis. So, but he argues with this, right? Okay. So he says, but when it comes to Yom Tov, he says there's no differentiation whether you select something to eat it right away or to eat it, later on. So it's the same as like cooking and baking, which is allowed on Yom Tov. You're allowed to eat it that day. So that's why he says in he says in the Rambam, you don't find this right differentiation. Tanan bepek kama. We learned in the first parak in the Mishnah there, the Bitzah. Rabban Gamliel Omer. Rabban says this, Rabbi. Af madiach v'sholeh begemara Also, it says you're allowed to, right, rinse and things like this. Okay, we'll see what that means. Tanya אמר רבי אלעזר ברבי צדוק, כן, כך היה מנהגן של בית רבן גמליאל שהיו מביאים דלי מלוא עדשים ומציפין עליו מים ונמצא אוכל למטה ובשורת למעלה. So he said that's the way they used to do, Rabban Gamliel's right, household. What would they do? They would bring, let's say some right, a bucket full of lentils, and they would pour water on it, and then what happened was that the food would go down to the bottom, and right, the chaff would go up to the top because it's lighter, The Tanya Ivcha, right? But it says we learned just the opposite in the Braita. Lo kashya ha be'afra ha begili, right? So it says no problem. One is talking about afra, one is talking about gili, right? So we'll see what that means. Rashi explains now. Perish Rashi madiach, right? So what does that mean? You rinse it b'mayim, right? You rinse it with water. V'sholeh absoret shetzaf lemal, and then you take out you remove the chaff which is on the top, right? So you're like separating there. Ifcha, right? So he says, right, that the food is above and the chaff is below. Afra the mata mina ochel, right? So then it's going to be below the food. Gili kash lemala mina ochel. So he says the gili, the chaff is above the food. Katav Rambam beperush Mishnah. Then halacha ki Rabban Gamliel. So the Rambam says we don't paskin like Rabban Gamliel over here. Interesting. וכן נראה שהוא דעת הפוסקים, the poskim seem to say that, שלא הזכירו זה, they didn't mention this halacha, interesting. וטעמה משום דמשמע דפליג התנא קמא, because it seems like he's arguing on the first opinion, the תנא קמא, והלכה כתנא קמא, so the halacha is like תנא קמא, the first opinion, in the Mishnah, the stam, satam ran tana kivate, because the Mishnah says that's stam, right, without any attribution. Aval, Rabbeinu Yerucham, right? But it says, but Rabbeinu Yerucham Pasach, he paskins Rabban Gamliel. He paskins Rabban Gamliel. But Mishum de'amar Rabbi Elazar ben Tzadok. He says the reason is probably because this rabbi said, "Kach hayu nohagim bet Rabban Gamliel." That's the custom was like that in his house. Umaseh Rab, right? So therefore, since it was a custom to do that, it must be that it's halacha, right? Otherwise, why were they doing that? Okay, interesting. All right, so let's see the Shulchan Aruch here. Let's see what's going on. Yeah, so it says here in the Shulchan Aruch, הבורר קטניות ביום טוב בורר כדרכו בחיקו ובתמחוי. So, right, he says that when you're sifting out, right, legumes on Yom Tov, selecting, whatever, right? So you do it the normal way, it says, and you do it like in your bosom, whatever, right? With tamchoy or with a tamchoy, which is like a tray, right? So he says in the parentheses here, if he wants to eat it the same day, right? Otherwise, you can't do it. If you're not eating it that day, right, on Yom Tov, then you cannot do this on Yom Tov, because then you're preparing for the next day, right, which is forbidden. That's clear. So he says, but not with the board and not with a sifter, right? So you can't do it this way because that's like the normal way, which is usually like large quantities. So therefore, the rabbis didn't allow you to do that, right? As we said, on Shabbat, if you would do that, there would be like you'd be liable, to desecration of Shabbat. That's very serious. So because of that, on Yom Tov they forbade that too, to do it the normal way. So says Shulchan Aruch, when was that said? That's when, right, there's more food than waste products. But if the waste product is more than the food, so then what you do is you take out the food and you leave the waste product. Why is that? As we said in the tour, right? It's less exertion like that. You always want to do it the way which is going to be less exertion. But when it comes to Shabbat, right, it doesn't apply this concept. What we're saying here. You should know it's forbidden in any case. That's something else. So when it comes to Shabbat, by the way, let me just tell you guys, right? So you should know, right? When it comes to separating and selecting on Shabbat, the rule is like this, right? You cannot do selection, and separation like that of two things which are together, um, uh, unless what? Unless first of all, you have to remove the food from the waste and not the other way around, right? That's one thing. You cannot remove the waste product from the food. That's forbidden on Shabbat. Another thing is that you have to be eating that right away, if you're not eating that right away. So what does that mean right away? Within a half hour. As opposed to what we said over here, right? As long as you're eating it that day, it's okay. For Yom Tov, that's the rule. When it comes to Shabbat, if you're eating it like right away, for the following meal that's coming up now, within a half hour, so you can do, right? Select the good from the bad, take the food from the waste, and eat it right away. That's what you can do on Shabbat. So Shabbat and Yom Tov here are not the same at all, right? Different ball game altogether. Not the same thing. So let's go on. ואם היה טורח בברירת הפסולת מן האוכל, so it says, if there's more, right, exertion in removing the waste product from the food, יותר מהפסולת, יותר מטורח בברירת החול מהפסולת, אף על פי שהאוכל מרובה בורר את האוכל ומניח את הפסולת. So even though the food is more in terms of quantity, right? So what you do is you take out the food and leave the waste product. Why is that? Again, right, same thing. We want you to have less exertion, and this is the reason why we tell you this. You do it the easy way, right? Don't always take the easy way out, right, as they say, right? That's the way it is, right? Okay. So it says here, the Rama, Aga, ve'luzim u'botnim shenishtabru, right, ve'adayin b'klipehem, right? So he brings what we saw in Beit Yosef, in the tour, right? That if you have like nuts, right? Things like this, right? With shells, and they're broken, but they're still like, together with their shell. So, right? So it says, so therefore, in a case like that, you're just allowed to like remove the shell, and eat the food, because that's the way you eat, what else can you do, right? That's the way of eating. So, since that's the way to eat, there's no prohibition of selection, or sifting, when it comes to this kind of thing. By the way, let me just give you another example, to make you understand, right? For instance, let's say you're eating fish, right? And, fish sometimes, has bones, right? in the old days, that's the way it was, right? Fish had bones. Now they remove the bones, whatever, right? All kinds of things, whatever it is, right? So anyway, right, removing the bones from the fish is also selecting. You know what I mean? Or another example is like, let's say you're eating watermelon, right? And you want to eat the watermelon and not the seeds, right? So you want to select the seeds out of there and eat the watermelon. So these things you're allowed to do even on Shabbat, right? Why is that? That's the way you eat, How else are you going to eat, right? What are you going to do? If you're eating now, right, as we said, so you're allowed to remove the seeds and eat the food, the watermelon, right? Or remove the bones, and eat the fish, right? That's the way you got to do it. Otherwise, you have a choke hazard right there. You got to be careful, right? So, don't be stringent about that, right? Say, oh, I can't remove the bones, and then, you're going to wind up in the hospital, God forbid, right? Calling the emergency, right? So that's the thing. So we don't want that.
Isn't that where gefilte fish came from?
Okay. Explain to me what you mean by that.
Isn't that why Ashkenazim make gefilte fish? Because that way they don't have to deal with the bones?
Could be you're right. Yeah, I've heard something like this. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not a big, I'm not a big professor about Ashkenazi folklore, but you may be right. There's maybe a good point there. Gefilte fish is all fish, no bones, right? So that's the way it is. So yeah, I guess so. Could be, right? So, but we Sephardi people, we're like more courageous. We like to eat, the good fish with the bones. The good stuff. You know what I mean? It's not enough for us just to eat the filter fish. So we like the more gourmet stuff, you know what I mean? The gourmet fish. So, you know, we're a little more adventurous, you know what I mean? So if that's the case, right, you're a little bit adventurous, right? Then you like to eat that bony fish, right? Whatever. So then you got to be careful, right? Make sure, you know, that you know. And don't worry, you know, don't say, oh, I cannot remove the bones. It's selecting, you know, but you're eating it now. What are you going to do? Choke yourself? That's the idea, right? Okay, very good. That's the idea. So, okay, I guess we'll stop here. B'ezrat Hashem. We'll continue tomorrow. So today is tonight, Yom Yerushalayim. This is the day that the Israeli army conquered, right, the Jerusalem, you know, from the Jordanians who were attacking us, by the way, you know. They were shelling us, you know, this was in 1973, right? And we conquered Yerushalayim and also the Temple Mount, you know, everything, you know. So it was a big miracle Hashem made for us. After 2,000 years, we finally got, you know, Yerushalayim back into our hands, you know what I mean? Even though it's a little bit shaky, a little bit, the whole thing. But anyway, right, it is what it is. For now, you know, we have it in our hands, right? More or less, right? Not exactly the way we wanted, but as I posted, you know, a couple weeks ago, there's a Zohar, you know what it says, right? That it says the Geulah, you know, the redemption, he says, is going to happen like very, you know, gradually, slowly, you know? So like a little bit of light will come in, you know, and then a little bit more, a little bit more. So that's what we're seeing, you know, it's like a gradual process. We don't have everything that we want, you know what I mean? But we got something at least, you know, in our hands. That's also good, you know, we have to be thankful for everything. So, okay, Chazak Baruch, Laila Tov. We'll see you tomorrow. B'ezrat Hashem. Thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. See you tomorrow. Laila Tov.
Thank you so much.
God
Amen.
bless.
Thank you, Rabbi.
God bless.